Great. All right. So excited to kick off Dev Day. I think this is one of the first sessions, so that's really cool. Um, and I thought I'd share some of the tricks that I've kind of come across and discovered and implemented over the years um, to get things done in Bubble, especially things that aren't possible with native Bubble, but then you need to get them done right. So then I've always found ways to work around and find ways to kind of implement it anyway. So here are some examples of some of those things. So let me share my screen so you can see it. I'm just going to share my entire screen, right? And hopefully you see it. Just drop me a message if you can see my screen. I just want to make sure. Yeah, awesome. All right. So I have less than 30 minutes to cover 10 points, 10 tricks. So let's get started. So I've kind of listed them in order of complexity. So let's start with something that's simple. So image shapes with SVG. So this is something that I came across while I was building. It was a social network kind of social networking app, and on the profile page, what they wanted was something like a banner image, which was kind of curved. So I struggled, and then I realized that there might be a way to do it with SVG. So if you don't know what SVG is, I know most of you do, but SVG is basically markdown language, very similar to HTML, actually exactly like HTML. So this SVG in here actually tells the browser to render this rectangle, right? So using SVG, we could also provide shapes to certain HTML elements. And the way you can implement SVG could be with ChatGPT. You can ask it to just generate. Like for example, I've here in this example, I've said generate some SVG where I can insert my image URL, and then it kind of has the shape of a pentagon. So just as an example. So if you want to implement this, you can go in, throw in a HTML element. Let's see where I have some space. All right. And then in here, I put this in. I might have an image that I can use. Yeah, I've got this image. So I'm going to copy the link address, come back. And then in here, there should be a place where I can just throw in that URL. All right. And then when you preview this, sorry about all the other stuff on the page. I've just been trying to pre-build as much as I can. But yeah, then you get your custom shaped image. So consider using SVG for just some custom shapes for images and other elements. Okay, let's go to trick number 2, resetting inputs at will. I think this is something that came up in a developer chat I had recently, where people were talking about how it's difficult to control what inputs you reset. And what I've realized is that there's this we all know the reset relevant inputs action, right? So I think the trick there is to know what relevant means in that case. So let me pull in a form, and let's play around with the inputs on that form. All right. I'm going to paste that here. So I have this form. And now let's, okay, I've got a name, email, etc., etc. Now, let's say I want to reset only the name when I click on this button. Now, the way I would do that is I would say reset relevant inputs. Now, the thing about reset relevant inputs in what I've seen is that relevant means an input that's been referenced within that workflow. So, for example, if I was going to create a new thing with the values of these inputs and then say reset relevant inputs, I would have been able to reset those inputs that were used to create that thing, right? So here I can simply define my own definition of what's relevant. And here I can say, when input a name value is not empty. So this is kind of like a sort of a dummy conditional just to involve or just to reference this input so that when I actually preview this, that input becomes relevant to the reset relevant inputs. Cool. So now if I type in something, this should get resetted. But if I type stuff in other inputs, only the name should get resetted because only the name was referenced. So similarly, if in the condition, if you say, input name is not empty or input email isn't empty, then only the name and the email inputs will get reset. So that's something to try. All right, let's move on. Deferred loading of repeating group data. So this is something that I played with a lot when I was building complex apps with a lot of data that I wanted to display in a repeating group. And one of the things that I realized was when you have a repeating group loading on page load with all the data being defined on it by default, it causes the page load to be super long. So the solution to that I found is to basically hide the repeating group. And also, I just like to do this. I don't provide any data source by default. I just, let's say users. So I don't like to provide a data source by default. I'll provide the data source in here, and I'll say like, when page is loaded entirely. And then that's where I'll say, the data source is search for whatever users, right? And then here also, I'll say make it visible. And then by default, I'll just make it invisible, right? And then what that does is where's my repeating group? It allows the page to load, and then it starts rendering the repeating group. So the repeating group rendering and the data, pulling the data from the database, that part isn't then part of the page load process. So what happens is that your lighthouse score improves drastically because it doesn't consider that as part of the page load. So something to consider. I don't think I have too many users here to demonstrate this. Well, I have 3, but you should try this on tables with a lot of data. That really becomes effective. All right, let's move on to the next one. Responsive pop-ups. So if you've realized, there is no such thing as fit to width on a pop-up. And if you actually want to have a pop-up that fits to width, there's a trick to do it. So I actually have that set up somewhere. So yeah, fit to width. It's on a reusable element. I'm going to pull it in. And let's just say that I show it on page load. Right. So now that's a pop-up. Okay. So what I've done is I've created a pop-up and I'm showing like it's a repeating group on a row. So every new cell is going to be a new column. And the thing that I want to show you is that you can actually have it. So now the pop-ups width kind of is dynamic based on the amount of things that are in there, which is actually not possible by default on pop-ups. But the way that I'm doing it here is, let me show you, is that actually the pop-up itself has a transparent background. So it's kind of, no background color, so it's transparent. And I think I've made it, so usually I'd make this 100% width. So basically what happens then is that, my pop-up is more or less, 100%, but it's transparent. So this thing that you see inside is actually not the pop-up. The pop-up is the parent of that. This is just the main group inside the pop-up. And because the rest of the pop-up is transparent, it looks like this group is the pop-up. And then I can actually mess with fit to width conditions on this internal group. So it looks like the pop-up is kind of being dynamic. Let's move on to the next one. We've got variables in workflows. So I love variables on UI elements, and I think a lot of people do that. So I've seen a lot of people creating these dummy pop-ups, and then you'd probably have a group on here, which is like var number. So some number that you want to reference, and then you just store a number here. and then you can reference that throughout the app. So a similar approach, but for workflows. Let's use this button again, just because I don't want to create another one. I'm going to remove this workflow. And so say when I click on this, I want to, do a bunch of great calculations and whatnot. Um, and for that, I want to have a reference of either a number or a thing or a list of things, whatever that is. So what I like to do is create a custom event. And basically, let's assume that I'm trying to store a number here, just for simplicity's sake. Let's call this store. Let's call it number store, actually. Um, and it'll take in a number. And it will also return a number. So that's again a number. And basically, it's going to return the same number. Return data, return number. All right. So then what I do is when I go to my action, I basically, so again, you need to imagine this in a scenario where you've got a very complex workflow and you really want to store values that you can come back to and reference without having to actually do some complex search or filter or some functionality like that. So here, then you just simply trigger the custom event. You do the the filter calculation, whatever that is, just once. So say I do my calculation and my result comes out to be 5. I'll use a dynamic expression here. What happens is that the rest of this workflow can actually reference this step one. So the result of step one as sort of like a variable store, similar to what you have on that element variables on the element. So it's kind of a reference store. I think Bubble talked about having a special workflow step for a store or variables where you can actually store values. So I just tend to do something like this. So then I use that step and then just use that as a variable. Awesome. Let's go into something a little more complex. Um, okay, I don't think I have time to build it from scratch, so I'm just gonna reproduce what I already have. Let's see. Do I have it here? I think I do. Okay, so let's preview this. Now, let me explain what this is first. Essentially, if you look at any, I think this is usually in messaging APIs, if I'm not mistaken. So basically, you want to create a JSON, because I mean that's the use case. You want to create a JSON where you also have in the JSON an index of the actual um, object. So basically, you have a JSON array, and within each array, you want something like an index. So, for example, so this would be index. So since this is the first item, index is 1 and name is ABCD, and then so on and so forth, right? So this is what I mean. So the problem is it's a solved problem to create the JSON. You can just format as text. The problem is how do you source the index, right? So say you want to actually have the number, like the index of the iteration coming in, because format as text is at the end of the day like an iteration over a list of things. So the way I do it, let me show you. Index. All right. So now here what I'm doing is I'm searching for users and I'm formatting as text. So I'm creating a JSON array that's basically each object is one user that I have on my database, and I've got the email, the unique ID. So this is pretty straightforward. And then the index. So now the index is actually 1, 2, 3, 4. Like that's the iteration number that is happening in this format as text operator. And the way that I'm implementing it is basically with some string manipulation. So the idea is that if you want to know the index of the iteration, you need to know some unique identifier for that iteration. Um, because we don't have much to play with in this context here, we have to rely on, so we have the current items details. So like we have the unique ID and whatnot. And then we also have access to the entire string, like or the entire list of things that we are iterating on. So the idea is that you create a string. So that's what I'm doing here. I'm creating a string which is a comma separated list of all the unique IDs of all the users in my list. And then to find the index, I'm taking the current user's unique ID and I'm finding which position in that string comma separated list, comma separated text containing unique IDs. What position is my current user's unique ID at? So the way it's implemented is that you split that comma separated string by the unique ID of the current item's user's unique ID, which gives you a shorter comma separated list, and then you just count the number of commas, and that's basically how you kind of approach that. So I'm splitting it by this user's unique ID, and then I'm kind of um, grabbing the count, the number of commas essentially in that first substring, and then that's basically my index. So when I review this, I should get a JSON with the with the index 1, 2. I think it skipped 3 for some reason, but like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. Right. So that's the way I implement that. Actually, this from a forum post that someone was asking a question about, and this was my answer to that. All right, moving on to the next one, sending data from a reusable element to the parent page. This is something that I struggled a lot with early on, and it's a pretty simple solution once you know how to use the Toolbox plugin. So I think I've created a reusable element here. So I've got a reusable element here, and I've got JavaScript to bubble um, element here. So the JavaScript to bubble element is going to expect this function, bubble fn send. And in my reusable element, I have got, it's just a button. And in my button, I'm just running a JavaScript calling that function and then passing this value. Now, this in this particular case, it's a text, but this could be a number or a thing, whatever that is. In this particular case, I'm just sending ABCD as the value that I want to send from my reusable element back to the parent page. Now, the challenge is usually that you can send data from the parent page into a reusable element, but vice versa is tricky. But what happens is when Bubble actually renders a page, for example, the index page, where I've already pulled in this reusable element, when Bubble renders this page, it's all a single context, so to speak. So when my reusable element calls that function and passes that text, my page is not a separate context area. It's kind of like the same page. So it's going to receive that information, and then that way you can send information from the reusable back to the page and then do whatever you want with it on the front end. So let me show you how this works. So yeah, if I click on send, I've actually set up the JavaScript to bubble um, event here to show a message, right? And I'm going to cut this for a second because that comes later. So if I preview that, I should actually see that sort of message popping up. And if that message pops up, it means that it's being triggered on the page and it's not on the reusable. So if you saw that, so it received that message, which means that the information was sent from the reusable to the page. So something to consider if you haven't used that trick before. All right, moving to oh yeah, front end looping with the toolbox plugin. I love this. So did you know that you can run loops on the front end as well? And the way I tend to do this, although you have to be careful about it because if it goes into an infinite loop, your users will get really frustrated. But the way I do this is I use the JavaScript to bubble functionality again. So, for example, like I've set up an example here. So what happens is if I'm going to say loop 5 times, I'm going to run this, and it's going to say, send a value 5 into a custom workflow that I've created, and then the custom workflow is going to run that same function, bubble f and send, and it's going to send that number 5. And what I've done here, if you remember, I just moved this step to earlier, so I'm just using the same JavaScript to bubble event. Um, Here, I'm going to put in the logic to actually count the number of iterations. So say if I want to send it 5 times, then I'm going to, when I click on this, I send 5 as the number, and then here it keeps reducing that number by 1 until it's 0. So effectively, what happens is that it loops on the front end, and it stops when that condition becomes true. So something like this. So that's literally a loop happening on the front end, and each iteration. So this is like the value from the JavaScript to bubble element. So that value is constantly going to be stored on the JavaScript to bubble element if you want to reference that for any other logic. All right, moving on to visualizing JSON arrays in repeating groups. So this requires a bit of JavaScript, simple JavaScript, but it's something that you can ask ChatGPT for. So I'm going to preview this really quick. So the idea is that I've stored an array on where is it? Yeah, I've stored this array here. So ID and email, just like a list of users. This is a state, and it's a proper JSON array. And then what I do is I have an expression element where I'm just parsing that array in real time. All right. So every time that's parsed, I am the output is basically a list of texts, and each text is a stringified JSON object, and the output is a list of texts, obviously. So because it's a list of text, I can actually populate my repeating group with type text, and then use that expressions list of texts. So now every cell on this repeating group is essentially a stringified JSON object in here. And then basically in each cell, I am parsing that JSON object again to pull out the actual values and then push them out either into a list as a list of texts, or you can actually use other plugins, which I'll put the links into this doc and share it with everyone later. So you can actually pull out the details of each object. So when you run it, it becomes something like this. So if this is my JSON array I started with, this is the list of texts in my repeating group. And then what I can do is I can add another email address. Oh, I already have that one. And then it gets added to my list because it's coming here. So that is happening because each of the text in my repeating group is one object as text signified. Also, I'm going to share all of this stuff in Atomic Fusion. So if you guys want to copy and paste it into your apps to play with it, go crazy. And I think I'm out of time almost, but the last one I have is self data API calls for bulk creation of things. So this is actually really useful when you want to create multiple things, up to 1,000 things in a single action. So I don't like running, these recursive workflows, etc., to create things, because I've often found that it misses out a few items. I'm a little scared of that. So I tend to do something like this. So this is an example of one of the projects I'm working on. And I've set up so it's a data API endpoint that I've set up in my API connector. So essentially, this app is going to call itself from the data API. So it's going to call its own data API. And and here I am going to create something called encounters. And now each encounter is going to be represented by one JSON object with each field, each relevant field that we need. So if you only have one field and not others, it's going to ignore the others, keep them blank, and then just populate this field. So this season that I've picked here is called test season. So I'm just going to say create 3 of these just to show you. And in my app data, I've been playing with this before, so I'm just going to delete this one. So then there should be 3 new items created here once I test that workflow. So let me reinitialize the call. Oops. I'm just going to create one for now. Yeah, that's gets created here. Oh, those 3 got created as well. So those 3 got created plus the new one that I created just now. So bulk creation, guys. So you can actually create like 1,000 at a time. It's really crazy. You can create 1,000 things in a single action. So all I need to do is call this action from the workflows, create encounters from the workflow and pass it this dynamic JSON L as the value, and it goes and creates all of those things in a single action. So that's what I have for you guys today. I hope that was interesting. I know we ran out of time a little bit, but I'm going to share that document with you, and I'm also going to share all of these examples on Atomic Fusion with the link so that you can just pull it into your Bubble apps and play with it. All right, guys, thanks for attending, and I can't wait for the rest of the sessions. See ya.